right. Hello, friends. It is just now 8 o'clock. I'm going to give it just a couple of minutes for people to kind of get logged on. But in case you missed the announcement, tonight's webinar is going to be, by request actually, it's going to be kind of about calculating our calorie needs and then also getting our macros. Like I said, I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes while people log in. I hope that everyone has had a wonderful Labor Day weekend. I know for me personally, I was on vacation for the last week, so going back to work today was a little rough for me, but hopefully you guys have kind of gotten settled in, and hopefully your Tuesday didn't quite feel like a Monday like mine did. But I hope everybody out there is having a great kind of end of summer. The weather is absolutely beautiful, so I hope you're able to get situated and get out there and enjoy some of it while we still have the sunlight this late in the day, because we are unfortunately quickly approaching that time of year where we will start getting into getting darker here. As we get later into the year, it'll be dark by this time. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. So like I said, tonight's webinar is, or live, I guess I should call it, not really a webinar, even though I kind of present it like a webinar. We're going to be talking about calculating calories and also calculating macros. This is something that I get asked by clients all the time, by patients all the time. Coaches and stuff like that ask me it quite a bit as well. I think there's kind of a lot of mystery kind of surrounding calories and macros, and there's kind of this mystique that there is a perfect balance of calories and macros, and that there should be like kind of a right fit for everybody. But if you guys have tuned into any of my other lives, you know that my answer is probably going to be that there really isn't a perfect balance for every single person. It's much more complicated than that, and by that I mean that there is not a perfect balance that's going to suit everyone. Each individual person will kind of have a perfect balance, but it's going to be individualized and be different for every person. So as a dietitian, this is kind of the bread and butter of what I do. So if you really love doing math all day long, which I actually do, I love math, I always have, but a lot of people kind of go into dietetics not realizing how much math is involved. So it is a lot of math, but there are lots of computer programs and software to kind of break down some of the math for you so you don't have to crunch quite as many numbers, but you still have to know what you're doing in order to kind of come out with the best answers. Obviously, this is Instagram Live. I'm not going to be doing like nuts and bolts and up here with the chalkboard kind of showing you step by step what to do. I'm going to kind of go over very broadly and conceptually. But then, of course, as always, if you have questions or you want more information on something, just drop me a comment, send me a chat. I'm more than happy to kind of elaborate or send you other resources, kind of more in-depth perspective. But obviously, for the purposes of this platform, we're just going to be kind of going over the basics. So whenever I start calculating somebody's energy needs, so when I say energy needs, that's something I'm probably going to say several times throughout this talk. Energy needs refer to calorie needs. So that is, calories are what our body uses as an energy source, right? So it is, day in and day out, ultimately what is fueling our body. Calories come from our foods, and there's different numbers of calories. Those calories can come from different sources, but ultimately what it boils down to is your body needs calories to sustain itself. So when I start calculating somebody's energy needs, the very first place I start is what's called their resting energy expenditure, or REE. That is kind of like the name would lead you to believe. It is the energy that your body consumes while it is at rest. And when we say that, we mean that kind of sounds a little misleading. It's really the amount of energy that your body needs to sustain life. So it is the amount of energy that we need to keep your heart beating, to keep your lungs breathing, to keep your digestive system working. Theoretically, you're going to be at rest while all of that is happening, but it is really kind of, if you are in a vegetative state, that is the amount of energy your body needs to just sustain life for basic functions. There are a lot of different ways to do that. The most accurate way to do that is something that's called indirect calorimetry, or sometimes it's called a metabolic cart. There are a couple of different apparatuses that you can use that. They range from everything that kind of looks like a CPAP machine, that's like a mask, all the way up to something that kind of looks like an astronaut suit. Obviously, the more complex the machine, kind of the longer it takes to run. But the idea is that basically what the metabolic cart or indirect calorimetry is measuring is it's measuring the amount of oxygen your body is consuming and the amount of carbon dioxide gas that you are producing. So that is basically, in a nutshell, what your metabolism is. Your body is using oxygen to fuel your cells, and then it is producing carbon dioxide as a result of whatever those cells are doing. Now, obviously, I know there's some of you that are trainers on here. Obviously, we also have, that is, speaking obviously to our oxygen burning processes, right? There are other processes that our body doesn't use oxygen, but those don't happen while we're at rest, right? So while we're at rest, when we're talking basic metabolic functions, all of those processes are happening in the process, or in the presence rather, of oxygen. So that's kind of how indirect calorimetry or a metabolic cart will measure things. Most people don't go that route, right? Because obviously, as I mentioned, you have to have a machine of some sort that's going to measure that on-off rate of oxygen to carbon dioxide. They're really not that expensive. A lot of facilities have the ability for you to measure that, but you do have to go to like a healthcare type facility. Those of you who are Synergy Coach people who are on here, just if you're wondering, the bod pod has the capability to do that, but as we use it in Synergy Coach, we are not using the breathing tube. We're using kind of a standard cylinder system. So it's the way we're using it. It does not use indirect calorimetry. It just measures your body density. And then it calculates your calories based on a set equation of your body fat percentage to your muscle mass percentage. There are many other equations that back up. In the absence of a metabolic cart. So those are pretty easily accessible, but a lot of people just kind of aren't going to go that route. Certainly for every patient I see day in and day out, I'm not running them through the calorimetry machine. It just doesn't make sense, right? Because we typically don't need to know energy needs that specifically. And we also have lots of people kind of try to find, okay, back when the calorimetry machines really weren't that accessible, lots of people spent a lot of time doing a lot of math to kind of come up with equations as a substitute. There's several out there. The most commonly used is an equation called the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation. That has replaced the Harris-Benedict almost entirely in a healthy adult population. So basically, those equations take into account your height, your weight, and your age, and then throw in a couple of constants, and it's kind of just a plug and chug system of you plug in, your statistics or the patient's statistics or whoever it is, and then it just spits out a number. And those are actually surprisingly accurate. The Mifflin-St. Jeor has been shown to be more closely linked to it more accurately represents what indirect calorimetry shows. So it's more accurate than things like the Harris-Benedict equation. But the Harris-Benedict equations is also very accurate. When you are talking about apps such as, MyFitnessPal or Fitbit, most of those are using the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation. So it'll usually ask you for your height, your weight, your age, and then it kind of spits out a number for you. So no matter how you go about it, you're kind of getting baseline calories to sustain life, right? And then most of us are not living our lives in a vegetative state. So we multiply that number by what's called an activity factor. That activity factor basically increases that calorie range anywhere from 20 to as high as 70%. And where you fall in that range or how high you increase that percentage is going to depend entirely on your activity level. There are other factors sometimes, so we will use things like injury factors or stress factors, particularly in a hospital setting if somebody's recovering from surgery or has cancer or something like that. So there are kind of other additives on top of that, but in most healthy adults, we're just talking about an activity factor that is proportional to how active that person is. And that is where, shameless plug, having a registered dietitian or even just a clinician that does this all the time can be really helpful, because that activity factor is crucial to kind of getting the right calorie range for you on a day-to-day basis. And as somebody who teaches this stuff to college age students, I can tell you it can be very tricky and very deceiving how to get it right. So, people kind of, when you see, websites and stuff, be like, oh, well, if you're like moderately active or like sort of, or, super active or whatever the case may be, the name and then the nomenclature can be really kind of confusing about it. So what you really want is somebody who does this day in and day out and who uses these factors all the time and kind of has a really good clinical sense and good judgment in terms of what, based on an interview and an assessment, would be the right activity factor for you. Because anybody can use a Mifflin St. Jeor or equivalent. I mean, you can find a program on the internet to run that equation for you. It's not hard. You can get your resting energy expenditure in seconds. What you really want is your total energy expenditure, which is your resting energy expenditure multiplied by that activity factor, and making sure that that activity factor is correct is where having a clinician on your side can be really helpful. From there, that is where we get into macros. So that's kind of why it's so important to get the calories right. Because everything else, all of the macros are based off of the calories. And also the calories, as you can see, we went from, direct calorimetry, which has, measures oxygen off or oxygen in, carbon dioxide off. Now we're in an estimating equation type of deal. So we're kind of taking steps away from accuracy. So again, having somebody that's a clinician that really knows what they're doing with those numbers and kind of where to set you in that range is so crucial for your success. Oh, nice. Hey, Jackie, never heard of these? Great. Yes, so Mifflin St. Jeor, Harris Benedict is another one that we use in the hospital a lot. I mentioned that earlier kind of before you hopped on, but they're just kind of different for clinical settings. So anyway, like I said, if you have questions about any of these, I'm more than happy to elaborate. I'm kind of trying to fly through it and be brief, just because I know that math isn't like everybody's exciting, doesn't light their brain up with joy like it does mine, because I do it all day. But once you've got a good calorie base, we know, okay, how many calories this person burns in a day based on their height, their weight, their age, and now their activity. Then we start to play with the macros. So macros is short for macronutrients. Macronutrients are protein, carbohydrates, and fat. Those are 3 out of our 5 nutrients. So the other 2 nutrients would be vitamins and minerals. Those are considered micronutrients, not because they're less important, but because we need them in smaller quantities, whereas macronutrients we need in order of grams. Micronutrients we need in, milligrams or sometimes micrograms. But our macros or macronutrients are where we get our calories. So those 3, the protein, the carbohydrates, and the fat, that is where we get our calories for the day. And where proportionally we're getting those numbers of calories is going to depend, or kind of where we should be, I guess I should say, is really going to depend on the person, on their goals, on any clinical conditions they have that are going on. It gets really complicated really fast. So again, the first thing I said when I started this is that there really is no right macro balance for everyone, and there's not. Even within the same person. So I myself just sustained a shoulder injury. Even though I'm actually working out less, my protein needs have gone way up because my body is using that protein to build and repair tissues, even though it needed plenty of it while I was working out to kind of repair my muscles. It needs even more already. So again, having a clinician or somebody who knows what they're doing when it comes to kind of working with these numbers, and also has a clinical sense of what those numbers mean and what is right for different patients in different situations is really crucial to having good success. So I'll kind of just walk through each of those macronutrients and kind of baseline of how I calculate them. But again, it's going to be totally different for everybody. This is by no means a one and done, one size fits all type of nutrition prescription. That's not what we do around here. But, basically you need a certain proportion of your calories to come from protein. You need a certain proportion to come from fat and to come from carbohydrates. Generally speaking, your body is going to use protein to build things, and it is going to use fat and carbs primarily for energy. Your body has the capability to use protein for energy if it has to, but it can't make protein. So protein is the one thing that your body can't make out of other stuff. Your body can take your fat stores and convert them to carbohydrates if it needs them. Similarly, it can take carbohydrates that you eat and convert them into fat if that's what it needs. So really, the fat and the carbs aren't as important because your body, regardless of what you eat, your body is going to convert between those two based on what it needs. And it will do that based on what it needs in that moment. So like, let's say you're running away from a bear, your body's going to burn some fat cells to help you get up and going quickly. But it will also do it kind of based on, what it needs to recover and that kind of stuff as well, to replenish muscle cells and that kind of thing. Protein is the one thing your body really can't make. And that kind of, if you are a chemistry nerd and want to know, comes down to an amine group that's present, or a nitrogen group that's present on protein molecules. So basically your body can't synthesize that nitrogen. It can synthesize fat or protein because those molecules are basically carbon and hydrogen, and sometimes some oxygen, and your body typically has those molecules on hand. So anyway, I'll start with protein and then just kind of work my way down through how I go about calculating macronutrients. So we've got our calorie needs, and pretty much everything we're going to be doing is going to be based off of those calorie needs. And so it's going to be a percentage of those calorie needs. Protein is kind of the one exception. So the way I like to calculate protein is not necessarily based on the calories, but it is more based on the person's body weight. That said, that's not a perfect system because sometimes somebody's body weight is kind of very far from their ideal, and it doesn't really correlate to really a realistic protein number. So that in that case, I would kind of go back to percentages and kind of flux things around. But generally speaking, for healthy individuals, and particularly for people who are athletic or work out a good amount, the baseline number I tend to start with is about 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. So again, us in healthcare, we do everything in the metric system, right? So that's just kind of how we calculate it. But if just kind of an easier way to think about it, it would also be 0.5 gram of protein per pound of body weight. So let's say you have somebody who weighs about 150 pounds, they're going to need somewhere in the order of 75 grams of protein throughout their day. I had a webinar kind of a while back that got down into the nitty gritty of kind of how to time that out. And I'm certainly happy to answer other questions about that today as well. But just kind of for the sake of brevity, I won't get too much into it. We're kind of talking daily totals for today. Now that's for somebody who's kind of an average sized person who is working out kind of a decent amount, who's physically active, but not, doing a ton of strenuous exercise. Obviously, their protein, the more active you are, very similar to kind of that activity factor we saw earlier with the, kind of trying to calculate that total energy expenditure. Your protein needs are going to go up if you are working out more, if you're more active, but there's also things like if you are injured or if you are, there's kind of some kind of metabolic stress going on. Like say, for example, you have COVID and you are intubated and on a vent. Your protein needs actually go through the roof because your body is working really, really hard to build new tissues to replace the damaged tissue from the virus. So just to kind of give you a more clinical setting, that's kind of why this gets very complicated and why it takes somebody with a degree to handle this. It's not always as simple as somebody who's healthy. Healthy people are actually the easiest to calculate needs for. Then you also have, factors such as, kidney function and all that kind of stuff that also can play a role in how well your body handles protein. So generally speaking, for most adults, is going to be somewhere between 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So again, it's somewhere in the order of about 0.5 to 1 gram per pound of body weight. Probably one of the biggest mistakes I see people who are not necessarily trainers or like health coaches, but just, kind of people tend to overestimate protein. And I don't really know where that comes from. Some of you who are on here who are trainers, if you kind of want to share with me maybe what you were taught or kind of where you got that information from, that would be really helpful for me because I honestly don't know, because I've heard really high estimates, everything from, somebody who weighs 150 pounds being told to eat somewhere in the order of like 175 grams of protein. And I don't care how much weight you're lifting. Like, there's just no need to be eating that much protein. Your body really can't even make use of it. So that's just kind of, like I said, 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of your body weight. And then that's going to vary, obviously, depending on how active you are. What is left then is carbohydrates and fat. So like I said, those two matter actually a lot less because your body interconverts between them. Let's see. What about pregnancy? I've always heard there's no limit there. Yes, that is actually a really good question. So when it comes to pregnancy, there's a big misnomer that like, oh, you're eating for two. Your calorie needs and even your protein needs really don't go up that much until you're in the last trimester of your pregnancy. So again, the calorie needs kind of depend, or how, whether we recommend you increase or decrease or stay the same, will kind of depend on where you start in your pregnancy. So if you start your pregnancy underweight, sometimes we will recommend that you kind of give yourself a little boost just because you're kind of underweight anyway, and you're also trying to grow a fetus inside you. If you start your pregnancy at a healthy weight, you really don't need to increase your calorie intake until you get to week 12. At week 12, we recommend an increase of, I think it's 240 calories. Actually, I have to look it up, but it's somewhere we increase about 240 calories. And then your third trimester, it's 340 calories for your second trimester. It's about 430 for your third trimester. And then if you're breastfeeding, you actually kind of get to go gangbusters because after delivery, if you're breastfeeding, you're actually burning more calories than you were throughout your entire pregnancy. So as far as pregnancy and protein, I would definitely say that there's not really a limit. Your protein needs definitely go up kind of proportionally to your calorie needs. So that's a very good instance where I probably wouldn't calculate calorie needs based on the current weight, because your weight is going to fluctuate so much during pregnancy. And it also kind of depends where you started versus where you wind up in your pregnancy. I would do, in the case of pregnancy, I would do calorie needs first and then base protein needs off of that. But that said, like I said, your body's using protein to build things. So the average recommendation is about 25% of your calories should be coming from protein if you're pregnant. But that said, if it is higher than that, especially in the case of pregnancy, you're building things. You're building a lot of things. So it's certainly okay to go higher. But that said, it doesn't need to be necessarily as high as half of your calories coming from protein. Really, if you think about protein sources, it's going to be namely meats and stuff like that. And a lot of times people who are pregnant, those types of things just don't sound appealing. So a lot of times we kind of push it in pregnancy just because it's very difficult for people to kind of get enough if they're dealing with other issues like nausea or sometimes just GI intolerance to meat. I've known quite a few people. Jackie, as I'm sure you know, anemia is very common in pregnancy. Part of that is because your body is just kind of, it's been thrown through a curveball, but sometimes you really aren't taking in enough meat for a variety of reasons. For a lot of people, it just doesn't sound good. So we do kind of tend to push it in pregnancy. It's not that your needs are so dramatically higher, but a lot of times it's just kind of hard to get that intake in. So I hope that answered your question. And then Lauren, thank you so much for answering my question about the kilograms versus pounds. That's kind of what I figured it was, is that a lot of people recommend somewhere between like 1 to 1.5 grams per pound of body weight. And that's actually incorrect. It's 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram, which there's about 2.5 pounds per kilogram. So I think it's easier to just divide the recommendation in half. So about 0.5 gram per pound, or 1 gram per kilogram. Let's see. Yeah, awesome. So that makes sense. So that's kind of what I figured. And then I think, and this is not directed at anybody who's actually watching, but I've seen a lot of bad training in my life, both on the physical level, but also when it comes to nutrition recommendations. So sometimes, the protein needs is just out of control, and you really just don't need that much protein. Somebody who has sustained like third-degree burns on half their body, I wouldn't recommend that much protein to. So I'm definitely seeing some off recommendations there. So like I said, gram per kilogram or half a gram per pound is kind of my generic where I start recommendation, and then kind of based on who the person is, also based somewhat on their intake. How likely they are to get there, what type of training they're doing. So for example, somebody who is a marathon runner, they are beating up their leg muscles a good amount, but they don't need nearly the amount of protein that somebody who's doing kind of heavy weightlifting or heavier resistance training needs, or even somebody who's doing kind of a combination of the two. The more weight training or the more resistance training you do, the more protein you need. And like I said, I've had a whole other webinar about timing of that protein, and it is important to get it in kind of right after those heavier resistance training sessions, just because that's when your body is using it to generate muscle, or really to repair the muscles that you've damaged during your training session, but in an effort to make them bigger and stronger. So I think that kind of covers protein. If you guys have more protein or more questions about protein or how to get calories, you certainly feel free to keep typing them in the comments. I'm going to move on, though, just for the sake of time, to carbohydrates and fat. So carbohydrates and fat, like I said, are not super specific. There are some kind of general guidelines, but like I said, your body can convert between those two. So your actual intake, assuming your metabolism functions normally otherwise, your actual intake doesn't matter quite as much. Sometimes, like I said, with the pregnancy thing, I will also calculate protein as a percentage of total calories. Both ways are correct. Again, it kind of just takes a clinician mind and kind of somebody who does this all the time and to be perfectly honest, I very rarely do calculations for somebody once. I usually do a couple of different calculations, a couple of different ways, and kind of meet somewhere in the middle of kind of like, okay, if I calculate 25% of their calories as protein versus 1 gram per kilogram, where does that leave me? And, based on this person, are they realistically going to get that in their diet? Or what are some suggestions? Then it kind of becomes tasking of, okay, how can I get them from A to B, where based on what they're currently taking in to what they need to be. Carbohydrates and fat, I always calculate as a percentage of the total calories. So once you get that, Mifflin St. Jean or whichever equation you're going to use, or a metabolic cart if you're fancy, plus your activity factor, then you basically just boil it down to percentages. For almost everybody, I do just about 50% of those total calories are coming from carbs. It will vary, of course, depending on the person. If it's somebody who's not super active, or somebody who's maybe on a low-fat diet for a different reason, they're going to be getting more of their calories from carbs than fat. Or if they're an athlete, let's say they're a UK basketball player and they sprint for 2 hours straight, 2 or 3 nights a week, then they're going to need more carbs. So they might actually be somebody who needs 60% carbs. But kind of somewhere in that 40 to 50% range is where I go. So what that gives you, so like, let's say we have somebody who, I'm just throwing out a number. We calculate their energy needs to be about 2,000 calories in a day. So that would mean they need about 1,000 of those calories to come from carbohydrates. What that really doesn't mean much to most people. So then you kind of take it a step further. You have to convert the calories to grams. So for carbohydrates, there are 4 calories for every gram of carbohydrate. So what you do is you divide the 1,000 calories by 4. So you end up with 250. So that's about 250 grams throughout the course of the day. Now, depending on who that person is and, what their activity is like or their lifestyle is like, there may be a timing issue, or, they may need to spread those carbohydrates out. They may need more at certain times prior to working out. If they're diabetic, they're probably going to want to spread them out as much as possible throughout the day, or not exceed a certain amount with their meals. It just kind of depends on the person and what else they've got going on. But the general recommendation would be for a daily total. And then kind of based on how many calories we've got from carbohydrates and protein, then I kind of just do the rest as fat. For the most part, it winds up being about 30% of your calories are from fat. Again, you would then have to convert the calories from fat into grams. Fat is a more energy dense molecule, so you get 9 calories out of every gram. So you would basically divide whatever calories you got by 9. So, oh boy, I should not have set myself up for a live of doing math on the spot. But let's say, okay, so if you had a 2,000 calorie diet, 30% of that is going to be fat. So that would be what? 600 calories from fat, and then you would divide 600 by 9. And that would be the grams of fat per day. So I'm too tired to do the mental math right now, but you get the idea that that's kind of where you would wind up. So then you kind of have, a total calorie profile, a protein profile, carbohydrates and fat based on that person. And then any timing recommendations. And then of course, if you're trying to find ways to get you from A to B. So a lot of times what people are recommended to eat is not what they actually eat. So then, then it becomes kind of my task, like, okay, how can we coach you to getting the nutrition that you need? So in a whirlwind, that is kind of my breakdown of calories and macros. If you guys have any questions about where I got any of this information or want more specifics on it to use for yourself or for your patients or your clients, I'm more than happy to provide those. I mean, this is not rocket science. This isn't like trade secrets or anything like that. I'm more than happy to provide that information or elaborate or tell you where I got my data and stuff like that. And also if you have suggestions for more IG Live. So this one was kind of a specific request. But I, kind of have a running list in my head of questions that I get asked really often and things that I think people are interested in, but nothing tells me what people are interested in more than hearing from you directly what you are interested in. So just to kind of give you some ideas, topics that kind of have floated around in my workspace recently that might be of interest. A lot of people ask me very frequently about food allergies versus insensitivities. I do a lot of GI work, so understanding things like elimination diets, like the low FODMAP diet, Whole30, those kinds of things. I'm more than happy to kind of elaborate on those and what they're used for and what they're not used for. So that would be super helpful. I can also kind of point to the clinical base or the evidence base regarding allergies and sensitivities, because that is a world that has been cracked wide open in the last couple of years. Other things I get asked all the time, things like, is organic produce worth it? Or I'm trying to think of other questions. I feel like there's 1,000 that I get asked like every single day. Like, should I buy organic fruit? Or, what's a GMO and that kind of thing. So really anything food related that you can think of, I am more than open to suggestions. But, feel free to type a comment or ask me a question or just send me a message at some point if you pop something and you're like, hey, like I've been thinking about this or I've been reading a lot about that. What are your thoughts on it? Or would you be willing to do a webinar on it or a live on it? Chances are probably yes, because I love talking about food and I love what I do and I talk about it all the time. So with that, I will close, but if anybody has questions, comments, suggestions, concerns, I'll definitely be accessible in the comments or with a message, but otherwise it's great to see you all. Hope everybody has a great rest of your Tuesday. I almost said Monday. It's not Monday, but it felt like Monday. Enjoy your Tuesday. Enjoy your evening, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.